Alright guys, so this is going to be a video around how to beat players in the 850 to 900 kind of rating range. And because specifically I've been requested to make more about this particular range. So what I've got is I've got a 30-minute rapid game that I just played against somebody rated almost exactly 600 points lower than me. So what we're going to be looking at is what are the common errors that people make in that kind of rating, and what do you need to do to beat those players, whether you're rated around that yourself or a bit higher or lower or whatever. So this is what we're going to be doing. So my opponent is playing with the white pieces and starts with e4. I play d5, the Scandinavian, and we have pawn takes d5, which is correct. Now I respond with knight to f6, which is the modern variation, and now my opponent's knight comes out. So clearly I'm attacking this pawn, and he's brought his knight out to defend it. We have an exchange of knights, and now my queen comes out into the board. So right now there's little difference in what's being played. Of course, I do have one piece out in the board, and it is my king, but there is no knight here on b1 that can kick my queen. Okay, so I do maybe have ideas about throwing in checks. So I would say that at this point I'm already very slightly ahead in the game. So we have d4, and now knight to c6. So clearly what I'm doing here is a second attacker against that pawn, which is currently only defended once by the queen. So now my opponent plays c3 to defend the pawn, which makes sense. Okay, now e5. So my idea is, if my opponent captures, then I take his queen. He's forced to recapture with a king. There's no other legal move, because it would come with check and there's nowhere to escape. And that means that my opponent would then be unable to castle, plus I recapture my pawn with the knight on the next move. Now he doesn't go for that, instead he brings out his knight to f3, so decent play. And now I continue to develop. Alright, so I've got two minor pieces out into the board now, with bishop out to d6, and he does likewise with bishop to e3. Now I bring out my final minor piece, and it comes with a pin, obviously on the knight against the queen. Okay, so now the queen breaks the pin by running away. However, what that does mean is that the only defender of this knight now is the g-pawn. So if I were to capture, then the only piece that can recapture, it being that pawn, so white would end up with doubled and isolated pawns on the f-file, which isn't ideal. So I think actually a better move than this would probably be to develop. So bring out the bishop to e2, then if I capture, we've got bishop captures and there's no disadvantage to white there. And it is these little things that make the difference as you get up the rankings. So here obviously as well I could capture with the queen, which would force the a pawn to recapture, so we'd have double pawns again there. That is in fact what happens in the game. I capture and a captures. So pay close attention to the remaining pawns, okay? Look at my pawns here. I've got 3, 3 and one advanced one in the middle, right? White now has 3 doubled. So this is not a bad structure, but just watch these pawns as the game progresses. And now, again, I capture. The only way to recapture is with a pawn, and now these pawns are looking very, very weak. So that is creating an imbalance that I then want to make the most of later on in the game. So now I capture again on d4. So this pawn is attacked twice. So I've got pawn and knight, and it's defended twice by bishop and pawn. But if this pawn recaptures, then again, look, white is going to have isolated pawns, all isolated. Every single pawn will be isolated, and that would be very bad. So I capture, and now pawn captures, and just look at the gaps here now. This is terrible. Okay, so all I'm doing, very small tactical maneuvers, but designed simply to weaken my opponent's position. Okay, so next I throw in a check. Clearly my main goal now is going to be to castle. But I throw in a check, and again, because, let's say if bishop blocks, I can capture the bishop, and we have king captures, and that king now can't castle, even though it's going to have trouble finding anywhere safe now anyway. So in fact what happens is the king moves, and now I decide to castle kingside. One side effect of these isolated pawns with all these gaps between them is that the rooks do have a lot of access down to my side of the board, right? So, but now white's king is in the center of the board, the pawns are in a terrible state, and so my job now is to start to convert the advantages that I have, and one of my main advantages is king safety. My king is nicely tucked away there on the back rank in the corner. I do have to be careful about the rook coming to g1. Okay, so now white decides to throw a pawn up the board. I then move my rook across to e8. Now can you see the tactic that I have in mind with this move? Okay, the tactic is knight captures d4. And the reason is that the only defender of that pawn is this bishop here. But with moving my rook to e8, that bishop is now pinned. It's in an absolute pin. It cannot move anywhere because it would put the king in check, and you can't do that. So that's my idea. Now the question is, does my opponent spot the idea, and then what can he do about it? So I think there really is only one defense, which is rook to d1. So he's defending the pawn, and now I simply add another attacker against the pawn. So now he pushes h5, and I go straight in. So knight takes d4 with check, and it's also a fork here on these two pawns. King moves, and I grab the pawn on f3, right? Now the king moves back to e2, which is the square where it was before, okay? So what should I do now? Okay? What I decide is, let's do it again, right? We're still in the same situation. I put my knight back onto d4 where it's still attacking this pawn, okay? The bishop can't capture. Likewise, the rook can't capture because I just recapture with a rook, and he's given away an exchange, and the bishop still can't recapture, okay? So the king has to move again. So then now the king moves to here, and now I capture b3 with a discovered check as well. And I allow this fork by the king. So the king is attacking both my knight and my bishop, but I can get out of this by capturing his rook. Okay? So he can now capture one of these pieces, but then the other one is going to escape. Okay, so the king was actually there in a skewer, right? So there's no defender of the rook behind. So actually a better move here would probably be of being king back to e1. Okay, so moving in front of the rook and to here as well, where it's not defending the rook. So there is no defender of that rook now. But even if the king had gone there and I'd have played knight to here with check, then the king moves back, and the king couldn't move to there actually. So hang on. Yeah, in fact, yeah, because of my bishop here, that was the only square the king could go to. Everything else that's covered by the knight. So yeah, that move was actually forced. So it wasn't a mistake on my opponent, it was just unfortunate. Okay, so now we have the king double attack. I grab the rook, and I'm now well up in material. The king decides to capture the knight. I think with a board like this that the bishop is the better piece. I think I would probably have gone for the bishop, but he gets the knight. And now I push a5 to defend my bishop and just secure that side of the board a little bit. One of the other issues, of course, here is that the king is attacking my bishop, and that bishop is attacking a7. Okay, so this is a multi-purpose move. I am both defending my bishop and protecting my pawn with one move, which is great. So now the h-pawn comes down again, but that really is no concern. I think white has now used 3 moves to push this pawn, but it was never going to be a solitary pawn backed up with a rook is not going to be able to take on my whole army. So now bishop comes in with an attack on the rook, and I block the attack with c6. So that's kicking the bishop. Oh yeah, this was actually my blunder. This was a decent move by my opponent, because I missed the discovered attack here. I was kind of flicking between different things as well. So I saw the attack on my rook, but completely missed this one. So what I should have done is captured on h1. And then bishop captures, and that's a fair trade. Okay, but as it is, I go down the exchange now. So I attack the bishop with my pawn, then I capture. Okay, so it's a little bit more equal now. I've got 3 more pawns than my opponent. And now, bishop to d4. But this, again, opens the door to a very simple tactic. And the tactic is rook to d8. Okay, and now these 2 pieces are in a bind, because the bishop is pinned. So if the bishop moves anywhere, then I simply capture the unprotected rook, okay, with my rook. But likewise, if the rook moves off anywhere, I capture the bishop. So white is now forced to, well, he's going to have to defend the bishop at some point, probably with his king. But the king can't move here and can't move here. So it's a tricky situation now. So what I do now is I'm able then to move my bishop down with a second attack on his bishop. Now what this does do is it undefends the c3 square. So the king is now able to move to the c3 square. I simply reinforce my bishop now because it's technically undefended. I mean, he could capture it, but then I'd take the rook. The other thing you have to be sure about as well with pins like this is that the pinned piece can't escape with check. So, you know, if my king had been on f8, for example, white could have played bishop to g7 check. I couldn't even recapture. I'd have had to have moved, and then white would have grabbed my rook, probably with checkmate actually. But fortunately, I made sure that my king was on a light square where the bishop couldn't hurt it. All right, so we have king across. Now I reinforce my bishop with the pawn, and we have f5. And now we simply swap off in the middle of the board. And here's one of the other differences as well between a 1400 player and an 800 player, which is that I calculated that by swapping off all these pieces at this point, because I knew if I capture the bishop, he has to recapture with a rook. Otherwise, well, it comes with check, he'd have to move away, and he's just lost a piece for no reason. Okay, so I knew that he would have to recapture, and then I then have the choice whether I want to trade off rooks, and I do. But before then, I figured out that in this position, I had an unstoppable winning advantage. Okay, and to simplify the game at that point was completely in my favour, because, for example, now I've got my g-pawn, can make a dash for the line. It's only 5 steps away, and I have a big pawn majority on this side of the board. So just if this king was to 1, 2, 3, 4, and then has to get out of the way, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 moves to get a queen. Okay, now in that time, if at the moment this king starts to head to here, bang, Gary the g-pawn's on his way. Okay, and that's the problem for white. So on my next move I play g5, and white now resigns because he's figured out the same thing. Okay, so not many, there's nothing dramatic, there's nothing spectacular in this. There were no incredible tricks. A lot of it is just basic tactics, doing small things that get a small advantage, and those small advantages stack up and multiply over the game. Okay, so it starts with this move, which is probably an inaccuracy, right, to defend with the knight, because that allows me just to swap off, and now I'm ahead in development very slightly. Pawn comes out, 2 attacks, 2 defence, 3 attacks. Another option here, actually, could have just been to push e4 and kick the knight away again and gain another tempo. But in the end I decided to defend. Pins, and here, with this move, he's inviting the following sequence. Double pawns, and now white's in a mess. And this is something you see so often with players rated under 1,000, is that they allow their pawns to be fragmented. And look at mine. I mean, mine is still here at home. There's one pawn off the board, I have 1 in the middle, and all the others are just there, ready and waiting, so in case I want to castle. And then we throw in a check, then I castle. Then he wastes time with this. I mean, this attack was never going to have much effect. It's like throwing a snowball into a volcano, really. So there's a pin on the bishop. He spots this tactic, which is good. But now I can back it up. Now he just pushes the pawn again, probably run out of ideas. And now we come in with a fork on the king and 2 pawns. And so the king moves and he loses 2 pawns this way, right? Now the king moves again, giving up the rook. Right? The king could have moved, for example, to here, would have been absolutely fine. So, I mean, that's just the blunder, really. He's abandoning, he's allowing a high-value piece to be captured in return for a minor piece. Now, what I missed was this nice bishop move as well. He doesn't play it yet, we have a little bit more, but this was a really good move. So this is a double attack. He's attacking both my rooks with a single move, whereas on previously he wasn't attacking either. I missed it. I should have, if I'd have had my wits about me, if I was concentrating, I would have just swapped off the rooks and I would have had a significant advantage. I'd have had the only rook on the board then. Instead, I wasn't paying attention. In 7 seconds. So he spent 48 seconds preparing that idea, which was very good move and time definitely well spent. So I go back down the exchange. But now again, with this move, what is that move doing? I mean, this bishop can't touch my king. My king is on a light-coloured square. My pawns are on light-coloured squares. The bishop's doing almost nothing there. But with this move, it was just very slightly slack, because it allows me to do this and allows me to put pressure on my opponent. And there again, and then we swap off, and that's the end of the game. Right? It's nothing. There's no fireworks there. There's no brilliancy. It's just doing those little things that get you the little advantages, and the little advantages stack up and multiply throughout the game, leading to what, in the end, even though I blundered the exchange, leading to a very comfortable win. So, what do you need to do to beat players around the 800 to 900 mark? Well, I think my opponent did pretty well, but I think that it started to go wrong a little bit even at the start. I mean, clearly there were some tactics, some of which he spotted and some of which he didn't. And so much of chess, of course, is about tactics. But I think even at the start, things like bringing the knight out here to defend the pawn was not the best idea. In fact, the best move here, which you very often see in gambit lines, is actually to forget about your extra pawn and give it up and instead focus on your own development, right? But with this, I recaptured the pawn and now he swaps off his knight, and you can see I'm just half a step in front now, okay? And this is how the game progresses. So chess is down to small differences, small advantages. So yeah, how to beat players like this? That was a reasonable move. Let's spot the patterns. Yeah, I think this was an error. I think the queen to b3 that is clearly a turning point, because what I'm thinking about is, okay, if I do that, I think my opponent's probably thinking that looks like a move. Right? And really that's as far as it goes. This looks like a move, it looks reasonable. Okay? However, what I'm thinking about is, okay, if I capture the queen with my queen, what's going to happen? Okay, he's got to recapture with a2. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that his pawns are slightly weakened and that his rook might get into the game. Likewise, if I play bishop takes knight, he's got to recapture with that now. So this was a poor move. He'd have been much better off playing bishop to e2 and then allowing himself to castle. So that's all it comes down to. It comes down to the visualization. If I do this, what's going to happen? And is that better for me or better for my opponent, right? And this is the same. I mean, that's the difference between 800 and 900 and 1,000 and 1,400 and 2,400 players. Okay? It's the ability to visualize and consider every possible move as well on the board. I mean, one thing that jumped out to me in the game was here, when I played this move here, right? This was not the first. I didn't see this move straight away. Okay, I knew that my bishop was under attack, so I was thinking about moves like, should I bring my rook out? Should I retreat my bishop? But then this pawn's got an issue. Okay, two problems. Right, now what? Could I throw in a check? Well, no. The only check is that, and that's no good. All right, so that's probably one of the other big differences that. Whereas somebody would go, okay, I'll move my queen to a3, that looks reasonable, or b3 as it was, that looks reasonable, that looks like a reasonable move, right? What I'm thinking about is what's the best move that I can find. So if I can't find something that's satisfactory, then keep looking, try again, right? So this was a long way from the first move I thought of, but it was absolutely the right move to play because it achieve two things in one go. Okay, and so that's the difference. That's how to beat somebody. My opponent 868 rated. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed to Chess Bootcamp. And thanks for your attention. See you very soon.